everybody that's participated. Of course, our amazing 50 commentators from all over the world, and our great partners at ADNOC and Vitol and elsewhere. Really, thank you. So toot, happy second birthday to everybody on the podcast. We wake up this Monday morning with oil prices continuing their rise from last Friday. We're up this morning over 4% or nearly 4%, above $110 on Brent. WTI not far behind. So once again, the sort of the swings and roundabouts of this volatile market, waking up with a somewhat nervous disposition regarding supply disruption, rather than last week when it felt a little bit like demand destruction was starting to dominate the narrative. Let's welcome, as always, Omar Najia, Global Head of Derivatives of BB Energy, this Monday morning. Omar, your thoughts on the direction of this market? The sentiment still seems to be all things Ukraine. Your thoughts?
Well, look, I think basically, demand destruction is not something that the market's looking at, simply because, Brent's traded over $150 for a while, and that doesn't cause demand destruction. And, I think you're going to need something quite substantially higher than that to cause any kind of demand destruction. So the market has to go higher. And the reason why it needs to go higher is it needs to basically, reduce demand, because supply is stuffed, and stuffed not because we can't find any oil, but because everything is sanctioned, right? And that's even without Russia doing anything. So I think, the point is, at what kind of price level do we start to, remove some demand? And I think it's substantially higher than where we are now. The West still wants to go down the route of more and more sanctions. And, it's not possible. I don't know if you saw that story last week with the EIA saying that, you've got to work like 3 days a week from home and not drive on Sundays to reduce demand. But I think it's going to be, it's going to get very interesting. I think this is the first kind of war that I've seen where Western consumers are about to be, heavily impacted, and not just because of the war. I mean, they were going to be heavily impacted because of COVID and inflation and all this kind of stuff. And this is just the icing on the cake. So we're going to see basically, the peoples of Europe, USA, Australia, the whole West basically putting, their money, their income, and, paying a lot higher prices for energy, for food, for all that stuff, and, standing with Ukraine. So, it's going to be really interesting. Let's see how long that standing with Ukraine lasts. Probably, next couple of decades or so. So let's see how it goes. But I think considerably higher.
Well, let's welcome Andrei Belyi, professor, founder, and CEO of Balsan, sitting in the Baltic region. Andrei, this is a big week. I mean, every week seems to be big in this narrative, but ultimately the question of whether Europe will go the next step and sanction Russian oil exports. We have a big summit of NATO and the EU this week where it is on the table. What are your thoughts on that possible outlook?
It's an interesting question. First of all, happy Monday to everyone. And I would say it's a possibility, but I would hardly believe that they will eventually make it, because there are also disagreements between member states about whether to do it or not. As we know, both Germany and Italy seem to be quite reluctant about sanctioning imports of oil from Russia. However, there are other ways that Western countries might consider, and that would include access to technologies. And you would have already noticed that all big service companies left Russia. They announced that they're either leaving or they will not invest anymore into new projects. And that's already gives quite a dramatic and pernicious effect on Russian oil industry. And certainly in the overall context where there are already financial constraints in the Russian budget, that definitely a very big shock for the oil industry, which remains the biggest contributor to the state budget. So I would say that the West might consider other solutions which do not harm very much the Western consumer, right? Let's see how it will evolve, because it's very difficult to predict anything. As you rightly said, every week seems to be a big week, but I would say that the West seems to focus more on the upstream side and on the finance side, which indeed hurt more rather than hurting the domestic population. However, let's be clear, I will put a parenthesis now, saying it can be also different.
It can be what, sorry?
It can be also different. It can be that the level of reaction towards Russia will be higher, but let's say like this, I don't think it will be, because of German and Italian opposition to it. However, let's not be sure about.
Let's welcome Mark Oswald, Chief Economist and Global Strategist at ADM Investor Services International. Mark, the question of demand destruction, i.e. the idea that demand would be destroyed from the price of oil. But my question to you, Mark, is there other areas in which demand could be destroyed or be eroded at this time? In order, we saw oil prices having a tendency to drop last week, and the idea that there is an uncertain outlook for the Chinese economy, Europe. Could demand destruction come from elsewhere other than the sort of immediate correlation between oil price and demand?
Well, I think that the biggest problem for all countries, and particularly for China, I think we sort of discussed about the demand destruction in Europe and the US from increasing inflation. And let's not forget, the inflation isn't just about energy. It's food prices, it's housing, is a huge problem in a lot of places. So that's, I think there's two main areas. But for China, I think this is the area with the greatest sensitivity, because the one thing that they've always tried to do is trying to ensure that they don't get rampant inflation. And it's going to be interesting to see how China tries to counter some of these moves in commodity prices, above all energy, because that is really where the great vulnerability is. And it's also on the other side of the coin, they need to rethink their whole zero COVID policy, because as we're seeing already, because it's not just about the disruption to exports from China or imports to China. It's also about that in itself creates further price pressures, and the whole if the CCP is perceived to be losing control over inflation, there will be serious problems.
We did see over the weekend that Hong Kong are indicating a loosening of their COVID protocols and opening up into international flights, which would indicate, even though infection rates are still quite high, relatively speaking, in Hong Kong, that they may be stepping, baby steps away from that zero COVID tolerance.
Oh yes, absolutely. There's no doubt. Even last week, the shifts that we saw, which were announced by Vice Premier Yuan, it's quite clear that they are stepping away, because at the moment they're starting to realize, well, if we actually focus so much on COVID and controlling COVID, we're actually going to have more problems than we've already got. And they've got a big array of problems on top of the property sector, with prices, and with consumer demand, because they really need to lively up consumer demand, and hence all those measures which are being proposed to increase both fiscal and monetary stimulus in China.
Omar, we saw over the weekend the news that Germany had done a deal with Qatar on LNG imports into Europe as a sort of some sort of beginning of it. I mean, Germany's had that opportunity for a while, and they've sort of turned their back on it, and finally they're actually, rushing to Doha to try get a deal. Is there avenues, you think, sustainable avenues for Europe to build up alternative energy supplies, oil and gas, obviously not in the short term, but let's say over the medium term from Russia?
So let's get one thing kind of clear. LNG in terms of Qatar is always going to be priced in terms of who can pay more to go east than it ever is to go west. So you can forget about that. You can forget about Germany. Well, Germany, I'm sure, will build LNG plants and pay billions and millions and all the rest of it. And yes, if you want to pay, 2, 3, 4, 5 times the price of the energy that you're paying now, yes, of course you can do it. You can pay as much as you like, no problem at all. The other point basically is that Russian oil. So let's say, you have rampant inflation, commodity prices, blah, blah, blah. Well, one of the biggest surprises on the face of the earth is Russia, right? So what will China do? It'll buy discounted Russian oil. And the rest of the world, you know what they'll do? They're going to buy super expensive non-Russian oil. So inflation in China, inflation in the rest of the world, oh, big time. And we're not just talking about, we're talking about metals, we're talking about, grains, wheat, corn, sugar, everything, food inflation. So at the end of the day, I think that, it's not about, can the West do it? Everybody can do anything. It's just a question of cost. Can we all give up, fossil fuels tomorrow? Yes. But so what would that mean? That would mean basically that we'd need to invest millions and billions and all the rest of it and, warm ourselves with candles and all the rest of it. Can we do it? Of course we can. But is the cost going to be there? So it's again, the same question that I would ask in terms of sanctions. You can sanction anybody and anything and say, we're going to make it harder and more difficult and blah, blah, blah. But sanctions come with a cost. You've been sanctioning Iran for 40 years, hasn't changed anything. This is a nuclear power. This is basically a nuclear power allied with an economic superpower, which is China. We're seeing, I believe, basically, a change historically in basically the leadership of the world. And people don't realize it now, but they will. Over time, they will. And some of that will be associated
Realize what?
with
Sorry.
costs. That basically what you're seeing is the end of the Western empire. You're seeing the end of the petrodollar. Saudi Arabia is negotiating with the Chinese to sell them their oil in yuan. The Indians are almost agreed with the Russians to buy their oil in rupees. You can forget about the dollar. You can forget about it. And it's not that people don't like the dollar. It's because the dollar was weaponized. It's because, it's subject to confiscation at any point, political, blah, 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 blah. So it's not something that people want to do business with. So again, I think basically there was an amazing tweet by somebody in the Foreign Office in China who said, the international community is the following. And he showed a picture of the world. And the international community is North America, Europe, and Australia. But that leaves the entire rest of the planet, Asia, Africa, South America. So I think we have a huge problem. And I think oil and oil prices and energy prices have huge problems. And that will only be resolved by demand destruction. So pick a number. Stocks are very low. Demand is resilient. And unless you want to see, which you are, companies starting to shut down in Europe, mass unemployment. Take a look at the airlines. They shut the airspace.
Well, let's ask Andre about that. I mean, we talked about this last time you were on, Andre, and it'd be good to get a sort of an update and the appetite in Europe to take the pain for what maybe is a higher cause, i.e., freedom and other such things. The idea that Europe is willing, and I'm sure most surveys are indicating a sort of a willingness to take a hit based on some of the sort of value systems, because we are now talking about values. And I would disagree with Omar that the world isn't aware that China is rising into a world power. I think it's the exact opposite. The world is very aware of China rising, and this is the effort and the realization as to, well, what is the counter to that? And I think that's where the values conversation comes into play. So my question to you, Andre, is where do you think Europe is at in the context of its values? Obviously, we've got the Ukrainian president doing an amazing media job, telling us every day about our values and that we should be defending our values. Where do you think Europe is at in its willingness and that line, if you like, in putting values ahead of the price of oil and inflation and such things?
Thanks, Shane. Basically, I would also disagree quite a lot with Omar. The question is not only about values. The question is about security perception, right? And when you have a security perception or insecurity perception, then of course the willingness to pay becomes higher. And what is actually interesting that what we are observing in our professional world is that the willingness to pay for a diversification from Russia among member states of the European Union and among companies, industries in the European Union is not high enough compared to what citizens would like to see. Citizens turning off their heat, even though it's illogical, and we tell them not necessarily the Russian gas, but they turn off the heat in order not to have the Russian gas. So basically, the level of reaction among the public opinion is pretty elevated. Regarding China, it's also quite tricky. China indeed took a very soft position compared to the West regarding Russia. But at the same time, Chinese are being quite hard negotiators with Russia because they understand very well that now it's a great opportunity for the Chinese to get cheaper resources from Russia, to negotiate better supply deals. And by the way, they have always consistently reduced their volumes that actually they promised to buy from Russia. And after all, we are moving towards a very dangerous, from the global economic viewpoint, is we don't see a clear winner of this situation. Yes, I agree with Omar that the West is weakening. Russia is weakening even more. And China is not gaining yet. And that is actually quite a dangerous situation from the global economy viewpoint. And I can say that there is a realization of it among the Western societies, and therefore there is a willingness to pay.
Mark, we had over the weekend also, you mentioned Germany and Qatar trying to do a gas deal, the Japanese calling on the UAE to ramp up oil exports. Of course, Japan very heavily dependent on energy imports for both oil and gas, most of it coming from the Middle East. This growing call on these supply partners, UAE, etc., to open the taps a little bit. Saudi Aramco announced with its bionic earnings of over $100 billion, that they would be expanding production capacity. Of course, that's over the medium term. But nonetheless, this idea of the UAE, Saudi, where there is the potential to add oil supply, kind of breaking out from the grip of this OPEC plus agreement. Do you think there's any wiggle room there, or what will give there?
I think there is some wiggle room, but it's limited, and there is also a credibility issue. I mean, we've already seen with OPEC, they've been increasing at 400,000 barrels per month in terms of production targets, and other than January, I think they missed every month, and the gap keeps on getting larger. So they are aware that if they promise to deliver more, then they really need to deliver more. And I'm not quite sure that there really is the capacity there. And we also know that in the States, basically we are running down the inventories of drilled but uncompleted wells, and so that the capacity to up production there is also a problem. We're just going to have to live with this. That this is a choke point without a shadow of a doubt.
Do we get any relief, Mark, from the fact we're going into spring and so forth? Refinery maintenance and.
I think part of the problem is one of the biggest problems that we still don't discuss enough is how much productive capacity in the global economy has been lost. We know in the US, for instance, like roughly about 10% of refining capacity was lost during COVID. Some of it doesn't come back on stream. And this is where really the problem lies the whole time. People think that production can be switched back on like a light switch, and it can't. And particularly with some fields, it's basically a question of, well, is it even really worth it? Just to satisfy Japanese demand or European demand or US demand, it has to be commercially viable. Obviously, with these sort of prices, the commercial viability does improve. No question about that. But it's something we just are going to have to live with, and it's going to have to be. I think there is going to be a certain amount of demand destruction. It's not going to be that big because we've still got a lot of pent up demand and catch up to do because of the pandemic.
Let's go to the survey question and see where the view of the room is on this meeting this week in Europe. The European Union governments will consider whether to impose an oil embargo on Russia over its invasion of Ukraine, as they gathered this week with Biden for a series of summits designed to harden the West's response to Moscow. Will they, is the question. Will the European Union join the US in imposing an oil embargo on Russia? Yes or no? I suppose the other answer to that is maybe there would have been a third answer, is some will and some won't. And we've kind of seen that sort of cherry picking of sanctions thus far. Omar, we're Monday morning, as we said, oil prices on the rise again. We've seen this show before, sort of bouncing down to 100, back up to 110. Is there anything in the technicals that tell us where this market direction is, other than volatility between 100 and 110?
Well, I mean, if you look at things really simply, the highs on WTI are about $130, right? So the first question is, do you set new highs? If the answer is no, then basically, you might bounce around between here and 130 and then come off because everything's going to be okay, and Ukraine's going to win, and Germany will sign deals, and we go back to normal trading between now and the summer, no new highs. If the shit hits the fan, which apparently is unlikely, because the US.
What hits what fan? Sorry.
Yeah. If the doo-doo hits the proverbial.
You mean more than it has already? Is there a bigger fan here that I haven't come across?
You ain't seen nothing yet, trust me. So if the doo-doo hits the fan, and I like doo-doo, then you're looking at new highs over 130, and the next target over 130 is about 157 basis WTI, and then I think we're going to see, people really stand behind Ukraine as inflation skyrockets. Oil prices go whatever, so you'll be switching, you're heating off, you'll be sitting at home, not traveling, no summer holidays, and no cars and all this kind of stuff, because you want to make a political point. So what I think is going to happen is that demand is not going to drop. Everybody's going to be heating, ACing, driving, flying. Airline costs are going to go up because of all the, closure of airspace. So, flying times are going to increase, all the rest of it. So oil demand is not going to come off. It's going to keep increasing. And so are basically prices. And I think inflations are going to come. And I think the Fed is going to be, and the Western economies that are basically massively in debt, And you know what I think is going to happen? I think basically that they're going to do the only thing they can, which is more stimulus. And I think it's going to be a complete disaster. So we shall wait and see.
That's all going to happen this week. Holy God. That is a large fan. Andre, the sad proverbial hitting the fan, as to use Omar Najia's metaphor there, is actually this morning, sadly, with the threat to the city of Mariupol, the port city in Ukraine, where the Russians have given them a deadline. I think is it 10 a.m. or 8 a.m. local time, which could be any moment now, actually, to surrender, or God knows what will happen. A city that is already practically destroyed, but there is 300,000 citizens still there. And I think the quote I saw this morning by the mayor of Mariupol was I think literally quote unquote F off to the Russians. The next day could be quite consequential in that emotional sense of the scale of how harsh Russia is willing to be.
Well, I would not like to comment on what happens on the ground, because I don't know. I don't have, let's say, any accurate information from. Of course, there are many sources which come with different infos.
Well, the Russian government has, and its military has publicly announced this sort of surrender demand to Mariupol.
Yeah, but
that's not an opinion. That's a declared
I understand.
fact.
I understand. I follow from time to time this news. I cannot comment on this because
sure.
It's a different subject. It's a very complex. It's a very also emotional subject.
Yeah.
If we are talking about, let's say, global impact of Mariupol, besides all the humanitarian impact, of course, which we should not forget, right?
Of course, it's massive.
Deaf about, but in terms of global impact, or even about the impact on Russia-Ukraine standoff, military standoff, I'm not sure whether it has any impact. Yeah, it's not that with the fall or takeover of Mariupol, the standoff situation between Russia and Ukraine changes. It's not that with that we're going to have a different approach from the West, unless it hardens even more. And there is no indication of a better position financially and economically in Russia. We have to understand that Russia is locked within a very deep economic crisis, with possibility to repeat a crisis of 1998 without the opportunities the crisis of the 1998 gave to Russia, because everybody was jumping to buy the chip. Now is rather isolation similar to 2014, and with the possibility of a crisis of 1998. And that's a security dilemma for the West. I always remind it. Yeah, it's in a very complex country with a lot of weapons, nuclear, civil, and military. What if the economy collapses? And then we have instability there. What's going to be there the next? I fully agree with Omar that it's really difficult for the West to manage it and to mobilize the economic forces. But I would disagree that China is a winner. Why? China needs stronger Russia. China needs the West to be economically well, because it depends on the West in terms of markets. And China plays kind of like intermediate game, saying to the West that they are not backing the West on the Russian dossier, and they're telling to Russia that they're not participating in sanctions, but it doesn't mean that they're going to help necessarily. China declined to help Russia on 2 occasions. China takes an intermediary position, which is probably strategic calculation on one hand. On another hand, it can be also their understanding that they need both sides in the conflict to be relatively well stabilized. Yeah.
Mark, let's give you the last word with the survey result. Will they know 2-1? This room doesn't think European Union will move in that sort of final step. You're again just your engagement with Poland, a place where you have a home. Poland has absorbed over 2 million refugees thus far. Mark, what is the capacity for Europe and for Poland, firstly, to absorb this scale of refugees, and there could be another 2 million behind them?
Well, Poland's already starting to reach capacity limits. The efforts which are being made by everybody in Poland are absolutely magnificent, but there's a limit. The biggest problem, obviously, is that a lot of the people who are refugees don't want to go very far. They want to go back home to Ukraine. So actually moving them to Germany, to Italy, to other parts of Europe is actually not that easy. So there is a capacity problem, but Europe will have to deal with it. It's dealt with these sort of waves before. There were 5 million people coming in, at the height of the Syrian crisis in 2014, 2015. So it will have to deal with it, but it will come at a cost. And for that reason, that's one of the reasons why they can't really realistically go down this route of energy sanctions without actually coming unstuck themselves. They need all of this because there's the need for more movement of people, not less movement of people at the moment, simply because of the refugee crisis.
If we do see, Mark, and the same question I asked Andre, where the potential of this military conflict was to escalate, we remember on our TV screens, tragically, it was like this running nightmare of Sarajevo being bombed every evening. It's in the 6 p.m. news for years. And the West didn't do very much. This potential for the escalation here to continue, and Kiev hasn't really taken a whack yet. Where does that go, do you think, as it escalates, the Mariupol example, as to how the West can react in terms of what they have left in order to reply with?
Well,
other than cutting off, that's why I'm sort of coming to the energy thing, is that it's kind of like the last real weapon they have vis-a-vis this upgrading of the military conflict without going to war.
There will be decreases of imports of Russian energy, regardless of whether the governments do it. For companies across Europe, this self-sanctioning is a big issue because, as Andrew was mentioning, it's the popular feeling against this is even stronger than the governments are actually enacting. So people will, wind back, and it will obviously come at a cost, and they will find other sources. The only good thing I would say about this is because of COVID and all the disruptions, people are now used to the fact that they do have to look around. It's not like, oh, well, I'll just go for the cheapest. It's, I'll get it from anywhere I can and I will pay up and look big. That's effectively what the message has been. So, but, otherwise, really, all the other options now will start to look at, well, what will Putin respond to? And it does seem to be the case, but I'm no expert on this, that Putin will only respond to military strength. And that's sadly one of the realities that we may have to face.
Well, I think that's where we'll wrap up this morning, with oil prices up 3.5%. I think that final point Mark just made, I think, might be the dawning point of this week, as we see Biden and the European NATO alliance come together, is that there's no end to this peace that comes through negotiation, because fundamentally Russia, at the very least, wants a very big chunk of Ukrainian territory, Crimea and the eastern provinces, and the Ukrainians are not going to sign a document that legally parts with that. So this is a no-end situation there. And the only other answer is escalation of this militarily. And when that starts to really bite, I think this can go a whole nother level, as Omar started out this morning saying prices could go a lot higher. We'll leave it there. Thank you guys, as always. Mark Ostwald, Andre, Omar, not the greatest sort of mood to celebrate the second birthday of the podcast, but nonetheless, that's what we're here to do, navigate through the nastiness as well as the good. So that's what we do. Thanks, guys. Catch up every morning, 10:30 UAE time. All the best.